And let's do a quick sound check at this point. So hopefully you can hear me and see me. If you can, if you could just pop a comment in the live chat as usual, and then I will join you at past. See you then. Just doing the sound check again. Terry tells me that the sound is a little bit muffled. My counters and displays on the screen are all looking okay. So is that any better, Terry? I've just adjusted the microphone, that's all. Hello, good evening, and welcome to In Studio Live, the 89th edition. Wow, we're getting close to that 100. Right, welcome to the show. We've got an interesting one tonight. I've really enjoyed doing the preparation for tonight's show. It's something that, again, like I did the other week, it was a topic that I intrinsically understood, but didn't know the best way to try and explain really what was going on to anybody else. Having now done all that, I'm quite excited about tonight's show. So welcome, and I hope you can hear me clearly. When I did the sound check earlier, Gary said sounds good, and Terry says that the sound was all muffled. I have just spotted in the chat that he has said that it's now all good. So, phew, we can carry on then, because I'd hate to be talking about a complex topic, trying to simplify it, of course, with muffled sound. So, right, okay, so where are we? Let's get on with the show, shall we? Let me just say hi to a few people who've just appeared in the chat. Hello, Bob, welcome, and hello, Andy. Nice to have you with us tonight. Right, if you are watching the show live and you're able to say hello in the live chat, please do so. I do appreciate knowing who's there. It makes it feel as though I'm not talking to an empty room. Right, on the show tonight, we have got image feedback as ever. Not so many in the Facebook group this week, a little more than last week. So hopefully we'll get a few in there. Had a few sent to me through email from two people. So looking forward to looking at those images. Our main topic is this whole concept of exposing to the right, or ETTR, as it's sometimes referred to. Oh, hello, Jane. Just seeing you appear in the chat on there. This whole topic of exposing to the right. Now, let me state at this point, it is a more advanced topic, but there are benefits on it. But there are restrictions on how and when you can use it, which I will cover when we get to it. As part of it, I'm going to very briefly talk about preserving the highlights. Oh dear, spelling's getting worse. Preserving the highlights. That is different to exposing to the right. They are two very different techniques, and you do them for very different reasons, and that'll become obvious as we go through on there. And of course, right at the end, I will reveal my image of the week from the images that were posted to the Facebook group. Now, to those of you who watch this on playback, hopefully you're not skipping through this, although my stats seem to indicate that people are going straight through to when I provide feedback on their images. Naughty, naughty. But if you are watching this at this point on playback, do let me know in the chat, just so that I know who's watching this. Because numbers aren't that high on the live stream at the moment, and haven't been for a few weeks. But I think that's because quite a few people have switched over to watching it recorded. And if that trend continues, then it's fine. I don't mind the fact that it's people are watching it recorded, but with the numbers being low on live, I need to work out whether it's worth continuing with a live broadcast each week, or whether, if the majority of people are watching on pre-recorded, whether I just switch it over to being pre-recorded each week. Anyway, that's another topic for another time on there. But if you're watching on replay, just let me know in the chat, because that would be really helpful. Right, moving along. It is interactive whilst we are live. 10 concurrent viewers now. The 10 of you who are watching live, please chat away in the live chat. I will chip in as we go along, particularly with comments as we go through. I like asking questions as we go through. Flipping heck, that went down to 8 for a moment. I don't necessarily trust the counters here. Be interesting to see whether it's any different from what you guys are seeing if you're watching, but it's not looking good here. Right, carrying on. Feedback. Let me start off by doing feedback on the images which were sent to me by email. And before I do that, there's a file I need to open up, and I want to read out now. How am I going to do it? Right, I'll do that, and then yeah, you can see it there. It's not necessarily formatted particularly well. I'll do it like that. And this is the note that that Gary sent me with his images. And it says, hello Ian, this week I've been doing some work with shadows on a simple piece of white A2 paper. A hand torch and my camera held overhead on tripod, over the top of the paper, looking straight down onto the sheet. Yep, that makes sense. Vertical look down. One he's referred to as the polo crown. You'll understand why when I pull the images up. Was created using polo mints, sugar-free, if that makes a difference. Placed horizontally and vertically in relation to the light and in stepped ranks. Originally I had the design in landscape format, running from left to right, though I thought the result was okay. When I was editing the piece in Lightroom, turning the composition into portrait mode gives it an additional impact that it doesn't have in the original setting. It was interesting to see this change. Yeah, sometimes with abstracts, rotating them through 90 degrees does make quite a difference to them, and gives a very different feel. I don't know whether you tried that with any of the other images that you produced in the session. A couple of discoveries I made whilst doing this. Clean the paper thoroughly before you start shooting. Oh yes, we've all been there. I've had to spend a lot of time cloning out dust particles and stray hairs off the paper. Oh, excuse me. Oh, talking of stray dust particles, I think I've just swallowed one. Yeah. Cloning out stray dust particles, stray hairs off the paper. Yeah, though that happens, no matter how much you clean an object when you're doing sort of close-up work, you will still get that. To a greater or lesser extent, but as clean as you can get it will save you work later on. I would have got thicker paper or stuck it down onto a flat board to avoid undulations. Yeah, this is one of the things I was going to say. When you've seen me in the studio doing tabletop stuff and photos on white bits of card and things like that, the card I use for it is mount board. It's the board you would use for cutting mounts for mounting photos, and I find that works really well. It's nice and thick, it doesn't warp on there, and you can get it in sort of all different colours as well. So it's worth, I always keep a stack of different colours in, which I can just pull out and use here in the studio. One other interesting trick that you can do is to have a sheet of Perspex, same size as your mount board. Mine comes out of a photo frame that's about A2 size, and I put that on, and that then gives me reflections if I want those. So think about that kind of thing. Right, carrying on. The torch I use an LED variety with a glass lens screwed to the front. I found unscrewing the lens that the annoying circular focusing pattern that the lens gives is entirely gone. Yeah, good call. Basically, you've just got a bulb coming straight out, and it's a point source on there. With that works well. And it talks about the henge shots. You'll see those in a little while. Those are created with Lego pieces and represent the shadows at summer solstice. Basically a Stonehenge type setup. So I'm slightly distracted because I can hear noises outside on there. I don't think it's anything to do with my studio, but there was a couple of bangs going on outside that I think it was just people coming into the building. More complex patterns and less successful. He liked the simpler patterns rather than the more complex ones on there. And he'd like to know what my take on all this is. So let's head over to Lightroom and I'll tell you what I think. So here we are. I'll do Jane's afterwards. Let me do Gary's first. Right. Here we have first of the henge patterns. Now, this is interesting. Now, to me, this feels like an image on its side with the light coming in from one side. Now, I know why you've done that, because the sun rises. Actually, no. You've got the sun over this side, which is, as we normally look at images, that would be north, south, west, east. So you've got the sun coming from the west on here. So those patterns are the opposite way round to something simulating the summer solstice on there. So ideally it should be coming from the other side. So let's just deal with that. So now then. Oh, I should have an option on here to rotate, and it's not there. Huh? No, it isn't. Okay, we'll go into develop, lose down there, photo, rotate counterclockwise. I mean, that to me looks better, because that feels as though that's the direction it was being viewed. But I know what you really want is counterclockwise again, which would be that way. That's the sun coming from the east, so that would be a sunrise. It would be that way, assuming north at the top of our screen. So there we go. Now, I haven't researched Stonehenge to know whether all the things are in the right places. I suspect it's they're not quite. It'd be quite interesting to do that, to do it. Now, I like the whole thing. Looking at your histogram though, we've still got space at the top there. So I would be tempted with this to up the exposure a little bit more. And I'd like to see more even lighting in the background on there. Now, how can we do that? Well, the easiest way to do it is with a graduated filter. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run it all the way across like that. I'm going to take the exposure down, and just by take the shadows down, just by doing it with the highlights, I should be able to even that out, and maybe just a touch on the exposure. Now, that looks a little bit darker in the middle, so I'm just going to move this midpoint over a little bit and stretch that. No. Yeah, just stretch that out just a fraction more. Now we've got it's gone a bit bright on the edge there. What happens if I just turn that off? Right, okay, so I'm just going to bring that back. I have to bring it all the way back. Now, let's have a look with this graduated filter. I bring that, hang on, there's two of them on there. That's why something odd's going on. Let's get rid of that one. There's the one I'm trying to adjust over to that side. Still not quite evened all this out with it, a little bit with the exposure. Yeah, that's a bit more even on there. And have we overexposed any of it? No, we haven't actually. Take those highlight warnings off. So I would do something like that to try and even it out. So we've just got the shadows rather than that change in the background on there. So let's have a look at the next one. Right, these are the, oh, it says the Lego henge as well. So let's go into develop, have a look at the size of it. This is a slightly different version of it. It's, again, for me, this feels as though it ought to be rotated. So rotate counterclockwise to something like that. And again, I would like to fill in some of the things. Now, I can see you've been trying to get these sort of specular highlights on there. I think part of it is that undulations on the paper. I think maybe contrast. Ooh, no. Shadows. This is a tricky one to try and do something with. But I'd like to see it like we did with the other henge one, where it was all more even on there. What if I do exposure up and then blacks to darken in the shadows? We've still got a problem with this edge round here. Now, how can we deal with that? Well, the easiest way will remove the texture of the paper. With that would turn it all to white, which I don't want to do. I think I'm going to do something here which you never see me do, and that is a white vignette. I'll pull out a white vignette, move the midpoint in, feather it. Just getting it on the tips there, which I don't want. Okay, so if I square it a little bit. Yeah, it's a tricky one. I can't really improve it, but I do like it more vertical, which I'm guessing is what you've done with the polo crown. And again, it's one of those where I prefer to see it'd been nicer with that whiter background, but we've lost some of the detail down here now. So what if I bring the shadows down, the highlights up, the contrast up? Oh, I'm starting to blow things out and I don't want to do that. Clarity, will that do it? We're sort of getting there with it. I'm not sure I'm making this any better, I'm afraid, Gary, on there. I was just trying to show some options with it. So before, I think I've blown out a little bit too much on that, but I think it'd just be nice to see a bit more contrast in it. What if I bring the highlights down to preserve them and the contrast up? Making it look a bit more sort of abstract-y on there, before and after. I'm not convinced I've improved it any, Gary, on that, but the concept of all these is really interesting. The idea of using an object to cast a shadow. And I'll tell you now what next week's theme is going to be. It's been inspired by this, and it's going to be on shadows. Now, I'm going to post, probably tomorrow, a photograph to the Facebook group, which will also be undoubtedly be the cover image for the for the live stream, which is using this technique, but getting a very different kind of approach with it. So have a look at the Facebook group sometime tomorrow to see the image that I did. I should have thought of getting it sorted before the show. But really interesting shots, Gary, and some interesting techniques going on there. So I'd encourage people to have a go with that. Now, staying with the subject of shadow, I've got this one from Jane Lomas. I'm going to have a look at the EXIF data on here. Now, this is a really interesting shot. I really like this, Jane, but it's a shot that that is working better smaller rather than larger with it. I'll show what I mean on here. I love this little golden colour and then the green colour within the shadows on there. And I think that works really well. Now, one of the possible problems that you've got here is to do with being able to hold this steady. If I zoom right in, can you see how soft that image is? Now, I've said in the past that some of this is due to the optics on a camera phone. You're never going to get as sharp with a camera phone as you would with a quote proper camera. So sorry, I'm being distracted by the noises outside again. So I think this works really well as a small image. Once we start zooming in, it fails. And one of the reasons is not only to do with the sensor and the lens size, but looking down at the EXIF data. The shutter speed that the camera has chosen is, actually it's not too bad. I misread that at first. I thought it was a 20th of a second. It's 120th of a second. That's all right. But I think there might be just a little bit of camera shake in there with it. And I suspect the camera probably had trouble focusing with something like this. Because it will try to lock on to the areas of contrast. And you can see here, this is the most contrasty sort of areas, and it's blurred. So it works great as a small image, not as a large image. And that's partly restrictions on what you can do. But this sort of shadow play and the way of telling a story through a shadow, I think is really good. And again, I'm going to talk about this sort of technique next week when I cover shadows as a Sunday night topic. Right, okay, so that's the emailed images for this week. Let me go back to my presentation. Yeah, those bits we have seen. So let's have a look what's been going on in the chat. Right. We've got new joiner, Andy May. Hello, Andy. Welcome to the show tonight. Slap wrists for being late. Right. Back to the PowerPoint. Just the usual reminder: subscribe, like, and share. And I'm going to say it again at this point, if you're watching on the replay, please can you put a comment in there to say you are watching on the replay, because I need that information to decide where I go with the live stream in the next few months on there. So thank you for doing that. If you're not a member of the Facebook group and you're not signed up for my newsletter, the links are down below. I'd really appreciate it if you would do both on there. And let's move on to our topic for tonight, which is exposing to the right. Right. first thing to say about exposing to the right, it's not the same as preserving highlights. In other words, it's not about underexposing to make sure your highlights don't get blown out. I'm going to talk about the differences later, but exposing to the right is more about deliberately overexposing an image to get a better result at the end. Now, this is a bit of a controversial technique. If you look at it online, you'll see some people saying that the benefits are only marginal, and say it's just not worth the effort for the benefits that you get. I'm going to present the facts. I think it's worth it, and I tend to expose to the right anyway, as well as preserving the highlights. And in fact, in some ways, the in-camera technique is one and the same. You look at your histogram and you make sure that it goes right up to the right-hand side. But the phrase to expose for the right and why you do it is somewhat different to that. And to understand that, I need to go through and talk about how sensors work. So there's a little bit of technical stuff. Hopefully you'll find it interesting. But the technique of exposing to the right, the purpose of it is not about preserving highlights. It's about preserving detail in the shadow areas. And it's a technique which will allow you to get the absolute least amount of noise in the shadow areas of your image. But we need to understand how the camera works, in particular how the sensor works, to be able to do that. Now, as you probably know, in photography, everything is all about doubling and halving. Light and brightnesses work that if you want another stop of light, you actually double the amount of light to be able to do that. Or if you want half the amount of light, if you want less light by one stop, you halve the light. So everything works on this exponential scale, or almost everything. So your ISOs and all your stops are a double or a halve on the one before. So you to go at one stop from a hundredth of a second. If you want to gain one stop of light from a hundredth of a second, you go to a 50th of a second. Another stop will be a 25th, so you're halving it. To go the other way by one stop, you go 100, 200, 400, 800, 600th of a second, like that. So it's all halving and doubling. However, the actual sensor on your camera isn't. The sensor on your camera is a true linear device, which means the way it performs will not necessarily be how you think. Now, I introduced this to you a few weeks ago, Ansel Adams' zone system. So if you haven't watched that, look back through the live streams, have a look at that talk I did about the zone system, because I'm sort of building on that. And then a couple of weeks ago again, I did one about exposure. And again, I started with the basis of the zone system and looked at how we then use that to set exposure. And if you haven't watched those, you don't need it directly before watching this, but this will make a lot more sense if you have seen those two presentations beforehand. So go and have a look at those when you get the chance, if you haven't already done so. So here's the zone system. And the zone system is, we assume that the full range of brightnesses we can divide into 11 slots or zones. And that maps on, each of those is the equivalent to one stop, one unit of light within our camera. So it maps, if you've got a camera which can cover 6 stops, it will map as per that little graphic where your display below at the bottom of your viewfinder maps onto those middle 6 or 7 zones in the zone system. And when you get your final image produced, it all works out. We've got those zones and your light might be evenly on there. So I'm going to assume we've got a camera that's capable of seeing 6 stops of light for the purposes of the explanation. There's going to be some simplification going on here, and every camera is different, but I've got to assume something to be able to explain it. And if we use this as a theoretical camera that can see just 6 stops of light, and that the sensor is 12-bit. What do I mean by that? It means that each colour channel, red, blue, green, each of those, the value of that can contain a value from 0 to 496. So those are that's the full range of values. 0? Yes. 0. Actually, I think that should be 495. Anyway, that's the range that you've got. You've got 496 possible values for each of the 3 colour channels. And they all behave the same. So I'm just going to use a generic colour channel. I've coloured it grey on mine because the same thing applies to red, green and blue, and they all behave exactly the same. Again, that's another simplification, by the way, but we can assume that they all behave the same. So here on the graph, I'm going to have to slide out the way a bit, aren't I, with this. We've got these zones which then map to these 6 stops, and I've mapped them down across there. And if we recorded something right at the bottom of it, that would get recorded as 0. In the middle, we would be what? The middle one would be 2048, and right at the top in our final image it would be 4096. So it all works like that on your finished processed image. Now, here's where the problem comes, because this is only true for processed images. In other words, your JPEGs or your TIFFs, etc., etc. This does not apply to RAW files. Now, as I've said, each of these steps is actually a doubling or halving, depending which way you're going, on the scale of the light. But the sensor that's being used to record this light doesn't see it doesn't work the same way. It's not this exponential of double, double, double for each part of it. It's actually a linear device. So the sensor will record light differently. This is how it will record it. So this is how it would be in our final image, all the way along there, evenly spaced, each stop equal across there. However, when the sensor is recording that information, again, please be aware there's some simplification going on here, but I've not oversimplified it. This top stop of light is actually represented by half the values that the sensor can contain. So this one stop right at the top, anything with a value of 2048 through to 4069 will be within this one top stop of light. The next one down, halving and doubling, so it's half the size, so that covers this area. Next one down, half the size. Next down again, half the size, and in fact it's so close together here you can't even see where my line is on there. Certainly I can't on my screen. So that's how it's working, how the sensor is seeing the light. which means that, ignoring that approximation at the bottom, the brightest stop has a resolution, in inverted commas, of 2048 values. There's 2048 values, different values, which could be in there to represent that one stop of light. The next highest is 1024, so that is effectively that section. And then 512, 256, and so on. So what you can see there is we've got more colour resolution in the brighter areas of our viewfinder. So half the values equate to the top stop in there. This bottom one is really small, so there's only a very few number of values, comparatively speaking, 128 values for that bottom stop of light on there, on our theoretical 6-stop camera. Now, let's just take a leap to one side and talk about noise. Now, noise in an image is effectively where there is a big jump in the value between adjacent pixels. So if you've got a lot of individual pixels and they are all different values, as they normally will be, if there's a big jump from one pixel to the next, that's when it's appearing noisy. So now, hopefully, you can see that if the pixels had very similar values, you wouldn't notice so much of a change, and that's what's happening. We've not once the image is processed, all the images in the bright area are compressed, all the values are compressed, which means you get values very close to each other in there. I'll show you in the diagram how that works. Whereas in the darks end, we are expanding that to make it work. So let me show you on here. So what's happened here? If we look at the dark end, first of all, remember there's some approximation going on with my diagram down here on the dark end, but what I'm saying is genuinely what's happening, even though the diagram is, I've approximated it because it was the only real way I could draw it. So, thinking of the shadows, each unit on the top bar is represented by 682 possible values. So each of those, because they're all the same size, so each one of those, each stop of light, once the image is processed, equates to approximately 682 in this theoretical camera. Bear in mind that every camera is different, so this is not, don't quote me and say, oh, Ian says that it's 682. It's only 682 on my theoretical 12-bit camera that can do exactly 6 stops of light. So in reality, it's never going to be this, but this is how I'm explaining it. But at the darkest end, as you can see, that 682 there has been compressed down into this little 1 to 8 possible values there. Except it's not been compressed down because in reality, we're going the other way, aren't we? This is the reality of what the sensor sees, and then Lightroom or the camera itself, if you're shooting JPEGs, what does it do? Well, it expands that to give it a larger range. And it does that with all the shadow ones, which means that these values, which were really close together, in the processing of going from a range of 0 to 128 to 0 to 628 or whatever I said it theoretically was on my example camera, they've been pushed further apart. And because they're being pushed further apart, that means we're going to see more noise. So that's why there's more noise in the shadow areas. And this is actually made even worse by the fact that we tend to try and recover detail in the shadows. So if you're doing that, what are you doing? You're forcing those numbers further apart again, which gives bigger steps between adjacent pixels, which gives more noise. However, looking at the other end, what's going on at the bright end? Well, we've got our 600 and however many possible values here, relates to a much larger number here. So when it's actually we're photographing it, we've got it down here, we've got 2048 possible values here, and we're compressing them together from 682 into, from 2048 down into 682. So what are we actually doing when we go from here, what the sensor is seeing, to what we actually have in our final image? We're compressing them, we're putting those values closer together. Where there was a gap, we're pushing them together. Those points are going to be similar, and more, therefore we're seeing less noise in it. And this just means we've got a smoother, cleaner image at the bright end. This is why we don't see noise in the highlights in our image, because we started with a big range on the sensor, and as we process the image, what the processing software does is it pushes the values closer together to create the final image. Therefore, because they're all close together, those values, no noise, we don't see the noise. So how do we actually make use of this in reality? How can we use this to improve the images that we create? Now, if we know that that highest stop contains the most data, and we always want the maximum amount of data for our image, because that's where we're going to get the best image. It's not just megapixels, it's everything. The more data we have, the better the image. So if we try to get as much as possible into that top stop, that top end of the image, we're capturing more information there per unit of light. So if we do that, and then, even though it's brighter than it should be, when we darken it, what are we doing? We are pushing values closer together, which means less noise on there. So let me give you a real world example on this. This is a bridge in Dublin. Now this image that you can see on the screen is what I would call normal exposure. If I was to expose this correctly, this is what I would get, but this is unprocessed. So that's how you might think you would normally process this in the camera. And that's the histogram you get. So you've got maybe this dark area here round at the bottom. This big peak up here is the sky on there. And just notice where it is. It's not right at the right-hand side. Hang on, let me. I have two mouse pointers when I look at the screen. I was looking at the wrong one. So we've got this dark area here. Here's the peak for the sky, and we've still got a little bit of space above. Now, once I do the post-processing, what's happened here? Well, in the post-processing, I've brought the shadows up, and I've actually brought the highlights down a little bit. So you can see this dark area down here. Hang on, am I with the right pointer? There's this one. No. Oh, I get confused. No, right, I've got the right pointer. That's the dark one. That's the dark end there. You know, that dark peak's moved up a little bit to give me a bit more detail over. Yeah, I'm still confused as to which pointer I'm looking at the moment. No, it's got to be this one. Yeah, it has to be. And then my peak here for the sky, I've moved it in a little bit to give it that darkness on there. So that's standard processing on there as to what I've done. here's the example of exposed to the right. Now, it looks overexposed. The sky looks blown out. So you can see here, there's no detail. We've got a bit more detail in the shadow area because I've effectively overexposed the image a little bit. But what's important to note when we look at the histogram, nothing is off the end of the histogram. No, hang on, it's the little pointer. Oh, I'm confused. Yeah, it's the little pointer I've got to use. That bit is there right up to the right-hand side without going over. So it's not blown out, nothing's blown out, but I've got it right up to the right-hand side. With this, the dark area here is now moved in. So what that will mean is I don't have to raise those shadows in post-production. So when I process this in Lightroom, what's happening? The image looks very, very similar to the other one, but look at the histogram. It's the same, isn't it? I've moved those highlights down to where I want them, and the shadows have been moved up a little bit, but I've not had to do much with them. In fact, I don't think I've done anything at all with them on the shadows. So I've done that, but here's where the big difference is, and I hope you can see this on the video. These are the shadows. Now, you might need to go full screen on the video to see this. This is when I did the normal exposure, and on my screen, because I'm actually watching it on a TV monitor, I can't actually see the detail here, but there's a lot of noise, particularly around the area where the structure joins the water. It's very noisy on there in that shadow area and the reflection. But when I compare that with the one which was exposed to the right, there's a lot less noise around this sort of area and around this area. It's a much cleaner image by doing that exposure to the right. And that gives me the best possible image and the best possible amount of detail in the shot. So I hope that makes sense on there. But there are a few things that you need to remember about exposing to the right. This only works for raw images. Why? Because the raw images have that stretched mapping is the best way of putting it, so that the brightest area is half the image, the brightest stop is half the values. Once it's converted to a JPEG, which either the camera does or you've done it, or converted to a TIFF, that then has a linear thing, so that the one stop equals, on a 6-stop camera, equals a sixth of the values. So it doesn't work for images which have already been processed. It only works when you're doing raw processing. So you have to shoot in RAW to get the benefit of it. Oh, excuse me again. And because it's all about reducing noise in an image, for absolutely the best results, you need to shoot at your camera's native ISO. Now, for most cameras, that's ISO 100. For some Nikons, it's ISO 200. It's the basic, the normal lowest ISO, without having to have, like for example, with my Canons, I can enable ISO 50. So it's not my lowest ISO, it's my lowest standard ISO, often referred to as the native ISO for the camera. So it only works on that. Now, I said right at the beginning, this is not the same as, quote, protecting the highlights. Protecting the highlights is all about underexposing your image to ensure that the highlights don't clip, don't become overexposed. And what you tend to end up having to do with that is then brighten the shadows in post-production. If we are brightening the shadows, what's going to happen? We are going to create noise. So it's the complete opposite of protecting the highlights, where you deliberately underexpose and bring back the shadows in post-production. So what do I mean by that? This is a shot where I exposed it to protect the highlights, and then in post-production I brought back the detail in the midtones and the shadows in Lightroom on there. So it's a completely different technique in post-production, and it does completely the opposite. It generates noise, but it's noise I have to live with if I don't want the highlights blown out. Oddly enough, the technique in camera is all about looking at your histogram. This is why I've said so many times, get your histogram on display, check that. It's all about making sure you go up as far as you can on the right hand side without clipping your highlights. And if you do that, then you've got the perfect exposure for either exposure to the right technique, where you are going to then darken the image in post-production, or for preserving the highlights, where you're going to brighten the shadows in post-production. So that is what exposing to the right is all about on there. Let me just say at this point, the live stream is sponsored by you folks, and tonight's cuppa is from Paul Robnett. So cheers, Paul, thanks very much. Now, if you want to keep this live stream going as a live stream, then you can do so by supporting me financially through the link that's over my shoulder. It's also down below in the show notes. And you can buy me a cup of tea. Simple, small payment, which I really, really appreciate it when people do that. And I like to say thank you by putting someone's name on the mug each week. This week, as you saw, it's Paul's turn. Right, let's have a look what's been going on in chat. A couple of comments from Walter, who asks, when shooting at high ISO, I tend to overexpose and pull back the exposure in post-production to minimize the noise. Yeah, it's exactly the same technique on there. It's doing the exposure on the right. You're doing the same thing. So I say you get the best results with the lowest ISO. But if you have to go to the higher ISO, yeah, certainly make sure you're exposing to the right and bring down. What would be worth trying, Walter, on that is doing an experiment where you do it with effectively the higher ISO and exposed to the right, and the lower ISO where you don't need to do that, and just see how much that affects the noise. But if you follow what I was trying to explain, that will hopefully explain why your technique is working for you. And the other part of the comment was, may recall a photo of the bird I sent a few weeks ago, shot at 10,000 ISO, that was not too noisy. Yeah, it just shows that how the technique works. And it really does work, and it's worth doing it. And if you don't have to think about it. If you just think histogram, go as far over to the right-hand side. Anytime you're not shooting up to the right, you are throwing away data. If you think of it that way, exposure to the right will really help you with your photography. Right, okay, so moving along on here. And this time I'm going to look at the images that were submitted to the Facebook group. So let's head over to Lightroom and Facebook group. We've got 8 images here, and quite a few from Sonia this week. So let's go through on these. And this is another one of Sonia's underwater macro shots. some of these images, some of these creatures are really amazing. With that, I love the detail here in the eye that we've got on there. That is really stunning on all that. So very well done. It's just a brilliant shot. I rather like this one of the river and trees. Works nicely as an image. In fact, let's have it at full screen on there. It works really nicely. Nicely processed as well with it. So there's nothing blown out. And maybe just touching the blown out on there, but I think it's fine on that. If I just go to the develop, yeah, no, it's not quite blown out. It's perfect exposure on there. There's something a little odd down here, something in the foreground. I'd like to have seen either that cropped out or preferably the whole thing in to give a little bit of foreground interest, but it just works nicely on there. Great shot, Sonia. And oh, what's going on? Right. The next one, this is a truly scary fish, and I've just included it because it's really scary. Now, what I do notice about this though is this line down here of shadow. Now, I don't know what equipment you use underwater, but normally if I'm seeing a black line here, what that would normally tell me is that you've got your shutter speed faster than your sync speed. So my guess would be you've got a flash on here, some form of underwater flash. I think you were probably shooting at something like 400th of a second, whereas your camera can only actually sync up to, say, 200th of a second. And that will be your bottom curtain on there. That would be my guess on there. Let me know in the comments, Sonia, because I know you tend to watch these on the replay on there, whether I'm right. Go and have a look at your EXIF data and tell me what the shutter speed is on that. But it doesn't matter because it actually works with this black black band down there. It just makes it look as though it's looking round something. But that is a truly scary fish. John Barton, love the black and white conversion on here. And you've done it really well. You've got little specular highlights, which is absolutely fine on there. A little bit true blacks down here, but I don't think that's an issue. If I just get rid of those. I think that works really nicely as a black and white image with it. It's good conversion, and thank you for sharing it. That's the sort of quality of image I know you can create and is worth celebrating. And I love the fact that the tower just seems to be appearing out of the mists. It isn't, because that's where the buildings are, having been there. But the whole thing just works so well. And by the looks of that, it's pretty sharp as well, although it's difficult to tell on here because that's the maximum resolution I've got with it on there. A couple more from Sonia. This is an interesting one. Part of me quite likes the foreground reeds coming in there. I'm not sure about this dark here, so I would probably just pull that in to about there. I watch the clipping up at the top here. It's right on the edge of the frame. That's a weather vane or lightning rod or whatever it is. I'm also not sure whether we might want to, just to balance the image up, and this goes through your signature, just to bring that side in slightly, and I think that's just slightly stronger for it. It's a shame we haven't got a little bit more down below to get the full reflection of the tower in there with it. I'm guessing it just wasn't possible to do it at the location. Now this one, similar sort of idea, but I don't think this works quite so well because these twigs are cutting into the subject rather than framing it. If you could have got that just that little bit higher with the camera, maybe, I don't know what camera you're shooting with, but if you've got the tiltable screen and you can hold it up higher, and if you could get this, find the camera position where this was in the blank area and this line came through just below, something like that, and nothing was going through that, I think that would be stronger on that one. And then from John Bamber, this, polecat, I think he said it was. Lovely shot, like the black background and how it just stands out from there. I don't know what the resolution is like. I think there's some form of flash going off with that, looking from at the specks in the eyes. I might be wrong on that, but it's lovely lighting on there and really sharp detail on the whiskers and the fur. That is just one cracking shot, John. Well done. And then finally, late entry. Nearly missed this one, Andy. Sunset, the pebbles. I like it. I do like it. I tend to be a little bit harsh with some of your stuff, Andy, because you're good. I want to push you to the next level. I wonder what this. You've shot this from standard human height. I just wonder whether if you brought your tripod down and splayed the legs right out so that you were just about that far off the ground and looking through the pebbles, I think that might have been a stronger shot for it. But the colours are great. Everything's spot on. The only thing that's blown out is the border, which I'm not going to complain about because that's in post-production. So yeah, it's a lovely shot, but I would just think about changing the height you shoot from. There's a tendency that we always shoot from our normal height, and you can make an ordinary image into an extraordinary image simply by adjusting the height you shoot from. In this case, coming down. And I think if you'd come down, you might have got some of that sunset reflected in the water as well and added a little bit of the orange colour into the foreground on that. So that's that. Let's head back over to the presentation, which is saying, have a look in the live chat, and I can see the live chat on my screen here. There's nothing new. So, member photo of the week. This will come as no surprise. This week's member photo is the polecat from John Bamber. It's a cracking image and it works really well as a banner. So that's going to be the banner. I'll be putting that up there shortly. Hope you watch this on the get to see this on the replay, John. Thanks for submitting it. Really, really nice shot on that. Just one final thing. Andy says, you're right, that he'll try that next time. Yeah, of course I'm right. Of course I'm right. No, I'm joking. Sometimes I'm right, I think is the honest truth on that. So, I've already mentioned next week's theme will be all about shadows, and I'm also going to cover silhouettes as well. So it's going to be a little bit of something for everyone. I'm going to look at shadows out and about, how you can make them work for you in your images, but I'll also cover briefly how I create silhouette images in the studio for those of you who are studio photographers. So that's next week. Please share some of your shadow and silhouette images both by email to feedback@ians-studio.co.uk and in the Facebook group. And I've overran by 4 minutes this week. Sorry. So thanks for watching, folks, and do tune in again next Sunday. hopefully I'll still be here. I'm running the Manchester 10K next Sunday during the early afternoon, so I've got to get my prep done early for it. So I will see you Sunday evening, and if all that goes to plan, I'll have my medal with me and my finisher's t-shirt as well. So see you next week, folks. Thanks for watching, and until next time, as ever, keep making great photos. Bye for now.